Okay, so this is Chapter 14, Forging the National Economy, 1790 to 1860. This is one of those catch-all chapters that covers transportation and the Industrial Revolution, and it's the first Industrial Revolution chapter, one of two or so in the book, and this one covers primarily like the start of factories, especially textile mills, and how we slowly started to build our transportation network and how it looks different in the north than it does in the south. So this chapter goes pretty quick actually. We start with the population centers in 1820, and you can see that there's relatively very small number of big cities in the country. You have New York over here, which is the biggest with over 100,000 people. You have Boston, which is the next biggest, and yet it doesn't even have 50,000 people, so it's smaller than most of the suburbs of Chicago even. And then just get a smattering of others. What you notice is in the South, there are very few big cities at all. This is very different than 40 years later in 1860, when you can see already New York, Philadelphia, Boston, New Orleans, Chicago comes out of nowhere, all these other cities that have just massive amounts of people. And the difference of those 40 years is this Industrial Revolution. When you build all these factories in these cities, you need people to work in them. So people move to the cities. This is another table about the population increase. You can see in 1790, the grand total of our population was less than 4 million people. And then 70 years later, it's almost increased tenfold. There are over 31 million people. Something that's kind of ironic, or I guess I didn't realize this, and students seem to be somewhat surprised about this, is when we think of this time period, we think of the big increase in the plantation slavery in the South. We're going to study that a lot in the next couple of chapters. So you would think that the percentage of African Americans in relation to the rest of the population would have increased as well. But actually the opposite happens. So you can see here in 1790, approximately 19% of the population would have been African Americans, right? Approximately 757,000. And although that increases by a ton, right? By 1860, the start of the Civil War, you have 4.5 million. The percentage actually goes down 5 percentage points. You can see that reflected here between the green and the blue. And the reason for that is the massive amounts of immigration from Europe actually offsets the increase in the numbers of African American slaves. So our country has a very kind of odd racial history, and it's reflected in both immigration and slavery itself. When we talked about all these people moving to the United States, by far the biggest two groups are the Irish and the Germans. And you can see there's hundreds and hundreds of thousands in the decade of the 1850s. You're getting a ton. It's when we study the Civil War, you're going to see that a large number of the soldiers that fight for the North really aren't even Americans. I mean, they're Germans and they're Irish, especially the Irish. And the reason being is that was the only job that they could get at that time. And so it's kind of funny that you have these Irish people who, to be honest with you, really could care less about slavery. Many of them had never even seen a black person, and yet they're fighting and they're dying for the cause to end slavery. And it's not even really their cause. Their cause was to feed their families and to secure a monthly paycheck. Here's another break here. You can see the pie chart of the origin of immigrants from this time period, 1820 1860. You can see Ireland is the single largest group, and then the Germans. You're still getting some British. And again, that's kind of funny because I mean we never get any immigrants. A very small percentage of our current immigrants come from Great Britain, and yet that's how our country starts. And throughout the first half of the 1900s, we're still getting a large number. What this creates is a hatred towards these immigrants because these immigrants are coming over. Not all of them speak the language, especially the Germans, some of the Irish even. The Irish are practicing Catholics. A lot of the Germans are Catholics. and what they're doing is they're willing to work for extremely low wages. Immigrants always are. There's a reason why they're coming here, right? And so they're willing to work for an absolute pittance because they have no other options. And so there you start to see a single issue political party arise in the United States, and it's called the Know Nothing Party. And they are an anti-immigrant party, and this is one of their flyers. And they were against, especially the Irish. Now, if you've seen the movie, Gangsters of New York with Leonardo DiCaprio, Daniel Day-Lewis, it's an excellent movie, and they actually show this conflict within New York City between the poor Irish immigrants and the nativists. Nativists is another name for a person who's anti-immigrant who would be part of the Know Nothing Party. And so if you remember the Daniel Day-Lewis character, the butcher, he was the head of this nativist group. They were against the Irish. This is just a political cartoon which shows you that it's an anti-nativist, or I'm sorry, an anti-immigrant cartoon probably created by the nativists, and they're showing here the Irish immigrant depicted by the Irish whiskey barrel, and the German immigrant depicted by the lager beer barrel, and how they're running away with the ballot box because election laws had gone down so that all white males, whether or not they had property or not, were allowed to vote. And so with this huge influx of immigrants, after time, they were able to influence the vote. And so if you were a good old-fashioned English-born or English stock American, you were unhappy that these dirty Europeans were stealing the elections now. Okay, transportation revolution. So it starts really with the turnpikes, and this is a picture actually of the very first turnpike, although it's been remade probably a dozen times since then. 1790 in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and they're roads. All there are roads, and there would be where you would get on the road would be a guy, and he would have one or more pikes, basically pointed sticks, that would prevent you from going forward on the road until you paid the toll. As long as you paid the toll, then he turned the pike and let you through. And this is by 1832. There's nearly 2,400 miles of roads connecting most of the major cities. Now remember, most of the major cities are in the Northeast, so that's where most of the roads were. Then one of the main things that the federal government did early on in its history was to create a national road. It's like a main expressway, if you want to call it that, and it kind of links Baltimore with St. Louis, and you can see it's traveling there across. And the idea was that farmers would be able to get their goods to either the east or to the Mississippi River, and then you would use the more reliable, the faster transportation network of the river to actually transport your goods there. What would you do on these roads? You would use the famous Conestoga covered wagon. And if you see any of those old cowboy and Indian movies or the Oregon Trail and stuff like that, this is the type of wagon that you'd use. It's kind of like the semi-trailer of its day. The biggest transportation thing going on during this time period, though, was definitely the canal system. And I won't bore you with the details of the fight between the federal government and the state governments, but who should do this? Should the federal government finance and choose where these canals should go, or should the states? And eventually, New York, which you can see here, is bordered on the north by the St. Lawrence Seaway and two Great Lakes, Lake Ontario, Lake Erie, and they got Niagara Falls in between the two of them. And it has the Hudson River over here, and it's got Lake Champlain. And then you got the East River, and then you got the Atlantic Ocean right there. So New York is situated where if you can connect all these bodies of water, you could become really the transportation superhighway of the time. So they just decide to finance it on their own. So the state of New York builds the Erie Canal, and they basically link all these different waterways so that you can get your goods from Lake Ontario or Lake Erie all the way down to New York City and to the Atlantic Ocean and onwards to Europe at a very, very quickly rate. And so it really becomes a very important transportation network, and you can see all these towns up here, like Rochester, Syracuse, Lockport, Buffalo. They form basically because of the canal system. The spots where barges are either unloaded or loaded, so major intersections. Now the biggest thing with the waterways, including the rivers and the canals, is the steamboat, because if you're going with the current, without the steamboat, if you're going with the current, everything's good. But if somehow you have to go upriver, you can't unless it's a really, really languid pace of the river. And if that's the case, you still have to use long poles and just gut it out with manpower, or tie your barge to a bunch of donkeys basically who are walking along the river's edge or the canal's edge, tugging it, pulling it. It's unbelievably slow, and you have to pay all these people to do so. So along comes Robert Fulton, and he invents the steamboat. And now it doesn't matter which way that the river or the canal is flowing, as long as you got coal or wood to put in the boiler, you can create the steam, and then you can go in any direction that you want. And so this is invented in 1807, and it revolutionizes transportation. So after that, there's a big push to start digging more and more canals. You can see they want to connect Lake Erie with the far west over here. So you got the Ohio River, which is traveling down here, and they try and connect lots of other rivers and lakes to that because it's a main east-west river, as is then this whole Erie Canal system over here. What you can't see over on the far left would be the Mississippi River. And you can see here that the hint, though, and you kind of get the idea of why Chicago becomes one of the biggest transportation spots in the entire country. It's because it's the farthest southwest you can get by water from the Atlantic Ocean, right? Because you could go up the Hudson River, you could go down the St. Lawrence Seaway, you can work your way through these Great Lakes, right? And then there's canals over here, and you go over here, and all this other stuff. But this is about as far as you can get. And so that's when we start building the different railroads. The railroads all then lead to Chicago, especially from the south and the west, so that they can get these goods onto ships here so they can go elsewhere. This is just another map of all the major roads and canals. And again, what you can see is that the vast majority of them are located in the north. So if you're thinking ahead towards the Civil War, one of the major advantages that the north had was the transportation network compared to the south. Now, who cares, right? We've been all these slides about transportation revolutions and whatnot. It all comes down to money. And so what you can see here is the cents per ton mile. Okay, so if you wanted to ship something, like a barge full of corn or wood or something like that, how much would it cost you per mile? You can see if you're trying to use a wagon, so like one of those Conestoga wagons, right, it's going to cost you a ton. It's going to cost you the most. If you're just going downriver, good for you. You're lucky. But try and have something upriver, right? Same thing. If you're going canal's going to be a lot more money because it's man-made. You're going to have to pay tolls, right? And it drops and drops and drops. Here's the big thing. You can see right here once they start to use the steamboats, though, because it's prohibitively expensive, really, prior to the invention of the steamboat. Once they start commercially creating the steamboats, look at the price. It drops to almost, well, I won't say nothing, but it drops to an unbelievably low rate. You can see the same thing happens with canals, though, too. Is this, thanks to steam power, you're able to transport goods anywhere you want to. And that makes it so much easier to get goods for your new factory, for your new city, that you can actually earn profits and you can actually build more and more stuff in different places around the country. You're not constricted to being right at the water's edge, at the confluence of two rivers or on the ocean's edge. You can actually go upriver, go up to these Great Lakes. You can go farther west. You can go into the Appalachian Mountains because you can actually get stuff to that reliably on a regular basis. Clipper ships. Clipper ships are kind of an American invention in how we started to compete with, especially Great Britain, on the international trading level. And we built these ships that were extremely narrow and very long, and just put sails all over them. And as a result, they couldn't hold as much cargo as the British ships, but they could go much faster. And so they're still not steam powered, but they could get goods reliably across to and from Europe at a much quicker pace than British ships could. So we kind of carved out like a fancy niche in the transportation of international goods for America. All right, finally, this is basically the earliest version of a railroad. And you can see here it was just basically a platform on two rails, and they threw a steam engine on top of it. And it was initially invented in England. We quickly steal the plans and start making them in America. But the thing is that people were scared of these things because it was just this belching, loud, black smoke everywhere, and they didn't think it was reliable. They still thought that horse and carriage was, so they started having these contests. You can see here that in 1830, kind of reliably for the first time, these early versions of railroad engines could actually beat a horse-drawn carriage. So by 1830, there are only 13 miles of track in America, and 20 years later, there are over 9,000 miles of track. And between 1850 and 1860, there's over 31,000 miles of total track in the United States. You can see what the giant increase in this is. Because now you don't have to dig a canal, you don't have to be anywhere near water. You can build railroad tracks anywhere, over mountains, through mountains, under mountains. And you can see here the transportation network of the railroads begins. And for the most part, again, it's built in the north, and the northern railroads are built predominantly by Irish immigrants. The relatively few railroads built in the south are primarily built by slaves. Okay, textiles, and this is where the main part of the lecture from this chapter is focused towards, is the first wave of the Industrial Revolution in the United States. And really, it's all about textile production. Textiles, of course, is the creation of clothing. And so this is a picture of a typical cottage or shack in medieval, we'll say England, could be elsewhere in Europe. And they had something called the putting out system. So in the medieval putting out system, you can see here there's this giant loom in the background. The women would sit around and they're basically turning it. Usually it would be wool. This is kind of before the use of cotton. They would try and pull these big clumps of wool into string, right? And so you keep pulling it out. I'll show you a machine that they used to do that before. But once you make string, then you you put it on spools. This takes a long time too. Once then you put on spools, then you can actually hook up the spools to this loom back here. And it's real slow, and there's all these hundreds of different spooled threads that then you have put threads perpendicular to those in between, and then you move this thing up and down, and eventually that creates cloth. But this, you can imagine how labor intensive and how slow of a process this is. And so as a result, each family would basically have one of these looms, and they would create stuff, and then they would slowly sell it over the course of the year, cloth, to elsewhere in the village and whatnot, so they could create stuff. So this is what I told you about. At the left here is the spinning wheel. So this would actually create the thread, and on the bottom left and the bottom right is like a larger version of the spinning wheel, where you can actually create lots of different spools right over here. And these two inventions here, the spinning jenny, kind of kickstart the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain, which happens in the mid 1700s. Here's now a power loom, and you can see here all these different spools, right? And then you turn the crank, and that would spin everything. But it's all arm powered, so apparently these medieval ladies have ripped arms. And then, of course, we get to the cotton gin. The cotton gin is invented by Eli Whitney, and he does so because he's traveling around the South and he sees the plight of the slaves, and he sees how just labor intensive it is, not just to pick the cotton, but then they have to sit there, and these balls of cotton are filled with seed, and you have to individually pick out every seed out of the cotton ball, and then you have to, clean it of all the chaff and other plant matter before it can be used. And this is a massive process, and basically each person could only use like pick out the seeds of a big gob of cotton. Took them all day. So he tried to make the life easier on the slave by inventing a machine that could do that. And you can see what happens here is you throw all the cotton on this side, you turn the crank, and there's like a wheel with a bunch of like nails sticking out of it. And the faster that you spin it, the more and more you're able to like rip apart the cotton. And by doing so, that makes the seeds and other plant matter fall out the bottom. And the cotton is spit out here at this end, and it's all nice and clean. And it just revolutionizes the way that you clean cotton. You can do so just unbelievably faster, like 10 times, 20 times as fast as you could before. And what this does is it actually makes growing cotton a profitable cash crop, because everybody would just wear wool clothing before, and that was itchy, and it was different. You had to grow it on the backs, right, of sheep, whereas now you can grow cotton, and it's much cheaper, and it's much more easy to work in the cloth, and so this crop is actually useful. The problem is the growing of cotton itself is very, very labor intensive, and so this revives the slave-based plantation system, which had been slowly dying out in America.
Oh, all these textiles are being created really in one fairly small area in the United States, and that's the Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island area, New England. And you can see that after Samuel Slater brings the factory system to the United States, especially here in Lowell, Massachusetts, right along the banks of the Merrimack River, we're going to talk about is a kind of a unique thing that happens in American history. The textile industry explodes, and it does so with female labor. So it starts really in the 1820s, 1830s. You can see here's just a countrywide map that even though all the cotton is grown in the south, all the textiles are made in the northeast. So, Lowell, Massachusetts. There's this massive need for labor in these textile mills, in these factories that are creating cloth, turning cotton into cloth. The problem is that there aren't enough people to work there. There's not enough men. And so we already talked about Republican motherhood and this idea that women had to stay in the home and teach the kids. But they need it. The makers of these textile mills kind of recruited local farm girls throughout the Massachusetts, Connecticut area. And you have to remember these farm girls kind of already knew how to sew, and because it was kind of the female thing to do back then. So they recruited them. But how, we have this very sexist idea of that women should be in the home and men should be out in the workplace. And the whole factory system itself was new already, and now you're going to throw women into this factory system. So they had to create a setup that would be okay with society, with social norms. And so they create this extremely rigid system whereby the women would have to live at the factory site in like barracks, and their purity would have to be protected very harshly protected, that their femininity would have to be protected. But at the same time, we needed them to work back-breaking hours in terrible conditions so they could produce this cloth at a very uh, fast rate and a very cheap rate. So it's these two little girls in their work get-up, and then two Lowell girls at the factory themselves. What was their typical? There were girls from the local farms, and there were thousands and thousands of them. Now, by all accounts, the girls actually liked this because without this factory system, they had absolutely no way of making any amount of money on their own. They're completely within the domesticity or the domicile of their farmhouse, so they can only do what their mom said, they can only do what their dad said, and eventually they're married to some other dude in the village, and then they have to do everything that he says. Whereas if you're a teenage girl now working away from home, even though you're making an absolute pittance, you have a slight amount of free time, you're away from home, you got a little cash in your pocket, and you get to hang out with other girls who are basically the same, doing the same thing. So it's really like the absolute earliest type of feminist employment work ethic is happening at Lowell, Massachusetts. And remember, the College Board needs to test something about women in early America, and so they like to test a lot about the Lowell textile mills. And these are the boarding houses. So you can see here on the banks of the Merrimack. There would absolutely no men would be allowed in. They had very rigid bell structures, even more so than Mount Carmel, more complicated even than Mount Carmel, if you could believe that. And they would have matrons, basically like boarding house moms, that would do bed checks and make sure that all the women weren't sneaking out and doing nasty things with the local dudes. What was boarding house like? It sucked. Here's what I told you about the timetable. Next time you're in my classroom, look very closely at our ridiculous bell schedule that we have, and see if it looks familiar. There you go. Apparently, whoever designed the Mount Carmel bell schedule used to work at Lowell, Massachusetts, in the textile mills. All right, and then we have Samuel Slater. He's the father of the factory system. I already alluded to him before. Great Britain didn't want any of their blueprints to escape. They started the Industrial Revolution in the mid 1700s, and they wanted to keep it, and so because they were making a ton of money off of it. So Samuel Slater was a young British guy, and he memorized the blueprints to a textile mill, and then he snuck out of the country, made his way to America, found some rich dudes, wrote down from memory the blueprints to the textile mill, and went into business with them. I believe it was in Lowell, actually, and that's how the American textile industry began. We basically pirated the intellectual property of the British system.
So an early textile factory, they're not using electricity because we really hadn't harnessed it yet. They're not even using steam yet. That's another couple decades away. What you're doing is you're using water power. And so you got to find yourself a river. Hopefully it's fast flowing. And then you dam up the river and you put a big wheel in it, right? A big paddle wheel. And the force of the river makes the paddle wheel spin. And then the spinning axle here in the middle goes into the factory, and then you attach a bunch of belts and pulleys to that spinning axle, and that's what actually turns your machinery. So remember the slide a few back where you had that medieval woman who was like hand cranking that wheel? Well, now with the water wheel, that does it for you at a much faster and a much more powerful rate. So that's what speeds everything up. So you can see here, this would be the inside of this building now, and you can have here is a carding machine, right, which separates the cotton fibers so that they can be spun. So this would be done after the cotton was delivered to the factory. And you can see here this would be the axle and the pulleys. That's turning this, turning this. So you see there's gears all over the place. And then you got in this case women. We'll talk about the Lowell textile system in a few slides. And then over here on the other side of the factory, you got the roving machine, which then turns the spun cotton into spools. And then somewhere else you would have then the loom, which creates the cloth. Eli Whitney's not just known for creating the cotton gin. He's also revolutionized the creation, the manufacture of firearms in America. And he does so through the idea of interchangeable parts. Now, interchangeable parts works like this. So you had a gun that was created before this, and you would have a master craftsman, and he would create the trigger from scratch, the barrel from scratch, the grips from scratch, the hammer from scratch, all the internal moving parts he would create from little pieces of metal. He was like a master blacksmith. Problem is if then he sells the gun and the gun breaks, you basically have to take the gun to another master craftsman, or preferably back to the first guy, to fix or make a new part that's defective. That's very difficult. However, what if you're able to make every single part, every single trigger the same exact size, every single barrel the same exact size, every single grip the same exact size? And so then if a part goes defective, all you have to do is go to the bin of like parts and throw a new one in. And Eli Whitney is the guy who comes up with this. It's really, you could see flash forward to when the auto industry with Henry Ford and the assembly line. That's what we're doing to do that. And really, Eli Whitney is the first guy to come up with this, and it makes it so much easier to mass produce items that are frankly much more reliable because they know what the specs are going to be, and you could just ship off these parts everywhere. You just have big old boxes of parts that you're shipping up and down canals that can be assembled in different places, and all this, what if a city just needs new barrels and stuff like that. You got this guy, Oliver Evans, which we already kind of talked about, which the first locomotive. You can see the first automated flour mill. You're getting lots and lots and lots of factories that are harnessing either steam power or water power. It's basically through the same exact process, right? Because at the end of the day, what a steam power is using the power of steam to turn an axle, and that axle then turns the wheels. In this case, you have either steam or water powered the turning of an axle, which turns through pulleys and gears and whatnot, the different machinery of the factory. All right, John Deere, our guy. I guess he invents the steel plow, and it just seems like, how do you invent a triangle piece of metal? But before John Deere, plows used to be made out of wood, and they would break, or they wouldn't be able to dig deep into the ground. And the idea for farming is you want to dig into the ground, you want to break up the soil, you want to dig up the roots, the weeds, the trees, and stuff like that, so you can actually plant. And if you have now a steel plow, which apparently you didn't need as many horses or oxes to pull, and because it was sharp, you could knock through roots, and you could dig deep, and you could break down the soil. It makes it easier to plant, which means that you can grow more stuff. So that revolutionized agriculture in the United States. Now you've planted this stuff. How do you harvest this stuff? Well, if it's wheat, you used to have just a dude with a sickle. Sickle is like a big sword, kind of shaped like a U almost. And you just go up and down the rows and hack at it, and then throw it in a horse-drawn cart. Well, Cyrus McCormick invents the mechanical reaper, and that's what this is. And you pull it behind a horse, and this thing up here spins, and spins in the shape of, I guess, what the sickle would do. And you can just go up and down the road then, and it will just chop up, most of the wheat. And it's much easier and quicker to do so. So everything you can see here with this industrial revolution is less and less man labor intensive. It's more either harnessing steam, water, or in this case, animals. Where does he build them? Well, he builds them in Chicago. the McCormick Reaper Works, 1850 in Chicago. And you can see here again the principle of using all these axles and pulleys, and belts and gears, and what you're doing is you're creating essentially other gears and pulleys and whatnot to be thrown together and sold around the world to harvest wheat. All right, Samuel F.B. Morse. He invents the telegraph. The telegraph, and obviously we get Morse code from this. You can string a wire, and no matter how far that wire is, if you have one of these telegraphs on either end of the wire, you can send messages. Now they're not words, but it's the dot 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 dad dot 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 line dot dot dot, and as long as you know the code and you can translate the code, pretty much in real time you can send messages, which is amazing. When you think about when we're talking about the Revolutionary War, how messages would take upwards of 3 months sometimes to go all the way from a battlefield to Britain and back again. Whereas if they had the telegraph, you could send those messages back and forth in the matter of a minute or two. So that, think about, just from the transfer of information, how revolutionary that would be. So they plant the first transatlantic cable for this Morse code in 1858, and so you could then across the world, or at least between North America and Europe, you could transport information. Howe and Singer, they invent the sewing machine in the 1840s. So now you don't even have to have, you don't have to use just needle and thread by hand. You can stitch together all this cloth that you made very quickly thanks to the power loom, the cotton gin, and all this other stuff. Now you're able to very, very quickly create clothing by stitching together this cloth thanks to the sewing machine. And you can see here it's hand powered. Eventually they're going to make some that are foot powered, and then you can imagine then when they start sticking these things in the factories, they're going to make them both electric powered, hook them up to a pulley up here, and that's going to make it so that you can commercially create clothing at a very high speed. Now, you need to have a lot of money to create a corporation, to create a business, to create a factory. And remember, we're still when John Marshall is Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, even though the Federalist Party doesn't exist anymore. He's handed down these rulings, and there's a series of rulings here that I'm not going to make you memorize, but they're all pro-business. They basically all say that states are not allowed to mess with a factory or a corporation, and it protects these corporations that they're able to create these contracts which are enforceable, and it makes it easy for them to plan years ahead, to get large amounts of money, to have these contracts that are very, very intricate because they're trying to get stuff from maybe 10 different other companies so they can create a finished product to then sell thousands of miles away over the course of several years. And it's very important to have a successful modern business. And the Supreme Court was very pro-business during this time period, thanks to John Marshall. You're kind of your first incorporation law, which identifies that the corporation is a registered entity, almost like a living being, is first passed in New York in 1848. So you have this idea of laissez-faire, which is a French word. It basically means that the government doesn't mess with business. Communism would be the complete opposite, where the government is business and runs every business and owns every business. In America, we didn't have that. In fact, not only do we not have the government messing with business, but government actually assists capitalism, actually helps, gives them tax breaks, subsidies, free land, stuff like that. Distribution of wealth. So when you have this capitalism, what you have is people get very, very rich. You get definitely the haves and the have-nots. And so during the American Revolution, 45% of all wealth was in the top 10% of the population. That means that almost half of the stuff was owned by the top 10%. which is typical, right? Rich people own the most stuff. Flash forward to 1845. Now, at least in Boston, the top 4% own well over half of the wealth. 1860, Philadelphia, the top 1% own over 50% of the wealth. And so you can see and this happens everywhere where capitalism is present. It's happening today in the United States, where the gap between the rich and the poor is widening. And this can create its own situations where the poor feel that they're getting screwed over. This becomes very Howard Zinn-like stuff, and where they should then rise up and overthrow the rich or force the government to redistribute income from the rich to the poor. And then you get Schweikart's response, which says, look, the rich are the rich because they're awesome. And what the rich are able to do in a country is they rise everybody. And so that's why the poor people in America have it so much better than the poor people in, we'll say, like Uganda. You get the very, very earliest union movements. You have all these people who are working in the factories, and they're getting treated like crap, and they're losing fingers and toes, and they're working 25 hours a day, 8 days a week. And so they start to push back. And the best way that a group of people who work in the factory can push back is by a strike. The problem is that strikes were illegal at this time period, and so they're trying to figure out what to do. You have the Working Man's Party formed in 1829 in New York City. You get the Molly Maguires, which were coal miners, Irish coal miners, but they're just not effective until later on in the century, really during the Progressive Era. And it's because the Supreme Court, remember I told you it was very pro-business? Well, if you're very pro-business, it means you're very anti-union. And so courts around the country, especially the Supreme Court, basically declared these strikes and these unions as unfair restraints of trade. And so, in other words, that they were illegal. Changing occupation distributions. So for thousands of years, right, not Americans, but the people were primarily lived on farms. And America is no different. You can see in 1820, almost 80% of the population are involved in farming. And then 20 years later, it drops. Right? It drops precipitously to 63%. By 1860, you only have half of the country involved in farming anymore. So you go from well over 3/4, and then 40 years later, it's down to half. And where are they going? Well, you can see construction, which basically didn't exist at all. You get some guys going into construction. Manufacturing is a huge increase. Trade is a huge increase. And we're moving ever farther to the west, right? So you see the Oregon Trail there. You see the Pony Express. You see the southern route here that hugs the border with Mexico. And you can see a lot of them. They're all trying to get to San Francisco or to the other areas on the west coast so that they can ship goods in the Pacific Ocean. All right, so the America in the middle of the 1800s starts to I don't want to say break apart, but starts to specialize. And so the Northeast becomes the industrial section of the country. The South kind of grows all the cotton and has slavery. And the West, let's face it, is the Midwest. It would be Indiana, Illinois. That's where all the farms are that feeds the East and the South. So each area of the country kind of did its own thing. But thanks to the canals and the railroads and the turnpikes and the factories, they're able to ship this stuff all over the place. And so it makes it very efficient to grow the country at a very rapid rate. This is just another map which shows the different industries that you can see here. You can see that a large amount of the industrial type stuff is happening here. All the T's for the textiles. Right, see almost all the T's here. Shoes and clothing is almost all here in the north. And then you can see more of the agricultural stuff and the beef, right? The ranges are out here. And then you can see the different areas here. The corn and the wheat is here in the Midwest. The cotton here is the yellow. You still see some rice and some sugar cane. So you can see how America is becoming specialized. Here's Chicago in 1857. This is actually where the Chicago River, you're seeing it looking westward from Lake Michigan. So this is where the Chicago River dumps into Lake Michigan. So this right now, this would be like modern day Wacker Drive. Or I guess Wacker would go quite so far west, around here somewhere. Looked very, very different than it does today. In 1830, Chicago basically doesn't exist, right? It's just a small, very, very small settlement. By 1860, it's a huge city. And then you're going to see by 1900, it's one of the biggest cities in the country. So it's unbelievable how rapid Chicago's created. And it's created because of this area right here, that you're able to get pretty far west and pretty far south in the country by boat, but then eventually you run out here at Chicago. But if you build a bunch of railroads, this is why this area right here going south, pretty much right past where Mount Carmel is, all that land used to all be railroad land. And you could have all those railroads kind of meet up around here, and you could transport goods back and forth, and you could eventually get them to the Mississippi River and beyond, and elsewhere all over the south, all over the north, and to Canada. Okay, and here's our chronological slide. You can see here, I'm not going to bore you, you can read it on your own.